I never believed in ghosts, not until that night. As a bartender, I'd seen my fair share of strange customers, but the pub I worked at, it was different. People would come and go, but no one ever talked about the place. They just left, looking over their shoulder, almost like they couldn't wait to escape. I thought it was all nonsense. That was, until I saw her. It was just past midnight, the usual lull in the bar, when I noticed something off. The air felt colder than usual, and the lights flickered just once. Then, I saw it. A woman sitting in the far corner booth, her face hidden beneath a heavy hood. She hadn't been there when I started my shift. I remember thinking she'd appeared out of nowhere. Then the jukebox started playing, a song I'd never heard before. Suddenly, the door slammed shut and the whole room went silent, like the pub itself was holding its breath. That's when I heard the whisper, "You should have left when you had the chance." And just like that, everything changed. What I learned that night will haunt me forever. I'm just a night bartender at a small pub tucked away in the heart of the city, the kind of place most people overlook, unless they're desperate for a drink after hours. The pub's name is the Old Lantern, and it's been around for decades. Nestled at the end of a quiet, forgotten street, it's the kind of bar that seems to be stuck in time. The floors creak, the walls are lined with old photographs, and the wood on the bar has been worn smooth by countless hands. The city's been growing around it, but somehow, the Old Lantern refuses to change. But it's not just the outdated charm that makes it stand out. It's the rumors, stories of strange occurrences, whispers in the dark, patrons who leave but never return, and the eerie feeling that something's always watching you. No one really talks about it, but you can feel it in the air. People who come in, especially the regulars, tend to get quiet when the clock strikes midnight, and no one wants to stay past 2 a.m. The few who dare say it's because the pub is haunted. At first, I didn't buy into any of it. I needed a job, and this place was hiring. So, despite the creepy vibes and the locals' hushed conversations, I took the shift. I figured the stories were just that, stories. But that was before I began to notice things, strange things I couldn't explain. In the beginning, it was easy to brush off the strange things that started happening. A glass would shatter for no reason, the lights would flicker at odd hours, and the temperature would drop, sending a chill through the room. Nothing to worry about, right? Just typical old pub quirks. But then, it started to get weirder. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect things to stay normal. One night, a regular named Jim, who always sat at the far end of the bar, asked me if I'd seen the woman in the corner booth. He'd been coming to the Old Lantern for years, but this was the first time he mentioned her. "You've got to be careful," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She's not like the others. Don't make the mistake of talking to her. That's how it starts." I didn't know what he meant, but it was enough to make me uncomfortable. A few days later, a new bartender, Lisa, gave me a strange look when I walked into work. "You're new, right?" she asked, eyes narrowed. "You haven't heard about the rules, have you?" When I shook my head, she just stared at me, silent for a long moment. She didn't say anything more, but the warning was there, like she knew something I didn't. The weird occurrences picked up speed. A man came in, sat down, and ordered the usual. He was a regular too, but tonight something was different. His eyes kept darting to the clock on the wall. He fidgeted nervously, his hands shaking as he held his drink. "It's almost time," he muttered under his breath. I looked around, confused, but before I could ask him about it, he got up and hurried out without finishing his drink. That was the first time I noticed the time, 3 a.m. It was on nights like that I started hearing more about the rules. I wasn't sure if they were just superstition or something real, but the more I heard, the more I began to feel something wasn't right. One night, as I was cleaning up the bar, an older man with graying hair leaned over and whispered, "Don't leave the bar alone after midnight. It's not safe. Trust me, it's better not to ask why." He stood up and left without waiting for me to respond, and I was left alone, feeling the weight of his words. Every time I thought about the woman in the corner booth, the more unnerving it became. Some nights I'd see her there, just sitting silently in the dark, almost blending in with the shadows. I'd try to approach, but something in my gut told me to stay away. And then there were the regulars, their behavior becoming more and more unusual. They'd talk about the pub in hushed tones, glancing around nervously as if afraid someone might hear. It was like they were all in on something, but no one was brave enough to tell me what it was. I felt like I was slowly being pulled into a world that wasn't supposed to exist, a world that was bound by rules I didn't understand yet. Rule number 1, never stay inside the pub alone after midnight. At first, I didn't think much of this rule. I thought it was just the kind of superstition that old bars develop over time. But the first time I stayed alone after closing, I learned the truth. It was a quiet night, not many patrons, and the clock struck midnight. The regulars had left, and I was just finishing up the last of the cleaning. I was ready to lock up when I heard the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the back. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or perhaps it was a stray patron who'd stayed too long, but no one was there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold wind seemed to blow through the bar, even though all the windows were shut. I went to the back room, but there was no one there. The pub was completely empty. I decided to ignore the feeling and finish my task. As I walked back into the main room, I noticed the dim glow of the lanterns flickering. Strange, because they'd never done that before. Suddenly a voice, low and gravelly, whispered from somewhere in the corner, "Never stay alone." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't pinpoint where it came from, but it was clear. It wasn't just a voice. There was a presence in the room. I locked the door, ran outside, and never stayed alone in the pub after that. Not once. Rule number 2. Always close the bar shutters at exactly 3 a.m. The second rule seemed like a simple one. Close the shutters at exactly 3 a.m. I didn't understand why, but as I got to know the staff and the regulars, it became clear this was not something to take lightly. The first time I experienced the reason for this rule was a night when I was too tired to pay attention to the time. I was alone in the pub, and the usual shift partner had left early due to a family emergency. I remember hearing the clock strike 3 a.m. as I was finishing up some paperwork, and I realized I hadn't closed the shutters yet. So I hurriedly went over to them, but as my hands touched the metal, I felt a cold, sharp gust of wind blow past me. It was like the air itself had turned frigid. As I began to pull the shutters down, I heard a soft, scraping sound, a sound that made my blood run cold. Something, or someone, was scratching at the window from the outside. I jerked my head up, but there was nothing there, just the empty street, bathed in the pale light of the street lamp. It was odd, unsettling, but I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Then, the lights flickered, and I heard the sound again. This time, louder, more desperate. I yanked the shutters down, locked them tight, and hurried inside, my hands shaking. From that moment on, I made sure the shutters were closed on time, and I never questioned why. Rule number 3. Do not make eye contact with the woman sitting in the corner booth. I had heard the stories. People talked about her in hushed tones, but no one ever gave a solid explanation. She always sat in the corner booth, hidden in the shadows, a dark figure with a veil over her face. She never spoke, never ordered anything, and never seemed to leave. The moment she arrived, the air in the pub changed, heavier, colder, almost suffocating. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I'd seen her sitting there for days, and I decided to approach. I tried not to look directly at her. Everyone warned me not to, but I was too curious. As I passed by the booth, I glanced down at her face. Her eyes weren't human. They were a strange shade of dark red, glowing faintly in the dim light. I froze, my heart racing, as she slowly raised her head and met my gaze. I couldn't move. It was like something inside me was paralyzed, as if her eyes had some kind of supernatural power over me. I looked away, shaking, and quickly walked to the other side of the bar. The regulars, who had been silent, suddenly murmured among themselves. One of them, a middle-aged man, leaned in and said quietly, "You looked at her, didn't you?" I nodded, still frozen in fear. "She'll be watching you now," he whispered. "The rules are clear. Don't ever make eye contact with her again." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing red eyes staring back at me. I haven't looked at her since. Rule number 4. Never ask about the past. People who do are never seen again. The past of the old lantern is a mystery no one dares to unravel. It said the pub was built on land that used to be a cemetery, but no one can confirm it. The stories that circulate are chilling, but the more I worked there, the more I felt the past creeping up on me. One night, a customer, a man who seemed new to the area, began asking questions. "How long has this pub been around?" he asked. "What happened here? The locals seem a bit strange." The bartender, a grizzled old man who had worked there for decades, turned pale. "You don't ask about the past here," he said, his voice low. "Trust me, you don't want to know." The man ignored him, continuing his questions. "No, seriously, what happened? The pub looks older than it should be. That was the last time I saw him. The next morning, his tab was still open, the drink he'd left untouched. He didn't show up for work, didn't pick up his phone. He was never seen again." After that, I started to understand why no one asked. The past here isn't something anyone wants to revisit. Whoever does, disappears. Rule number 5. If the lights flicker, leave immediately. It's one of the simplest rules, but the most chilling. Every time the lights flicker, something is about to happen. Something bad. The first time I noticed it was a few weeks into my job. The lights above the bar flickered just once and then went out. The air turned cold. A deathly silence took over the room. Suddenly, the door slammed open, and a figure stepped inside. I couldn't make out their features, but the presence was unmistakable. They didn't say a word, just walked to the bar, sat down, and ordered a drink. The regulars didn't say anything, but their eyes told me everything. They knew exactly who that person was, and what would happen next. I quickly served the drink, but when I turned back, the figure was gone. The door was still closed, and the air had warmed back up to normal. No one spoke. It was as though they had never been there. From that point on, I made sure to leave as soon as the lights flickered. It's never a good sign. Rule number 6. The jukebox plays a song when someone will disappear. There's an old jukebox in the corner of the pub. It's never been upgraded or replaced. It's as old as the pub itself. It's an oddity, but most people never think much of it. That is, until the night I heard the song. It started quietly, the scratchy sound of a song no one had played in years. The melody filled the room, but it wasn't a cheerful tune. It was slow, haunting, almost like a lullaby for the lost. And then it happened. A woman who had been sitting quietly in a booth suddenly stood up. She looked around confused and then turned toward the door. The regulars didn't stop her. No one said anything. They just watched. The woman stepped out into the night, and just like that, she was gone. No one knew where she went, and she was never seen again. The jukebox had played a song, and with that song, someone disappeared. Rule number 7. If you hear the sound of footsteps behind you, don't turn around. This is the final rule, and it's the one that haunts me the most. It's the one I've learned to fear the most. Late one night, as I was locking up, I heard it. Footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, following me as I walked to the door. I froze. The hairs on my neck stood up, and the chill in the air was unbearable. I wanted to turn around, to look, to see who was there, but I knew better. The others had warned me. Never turn around. I took a deep breath and hurried toward the door, my pulse racing. But the footsteps kept following me, closer now, like someone was right behind me. I reached for the door handle and threw it open. The footsteps stopped. The air went still. I turned around, and there was no one there, no one in sight. But I swear I could feel the presence, close, almost suffocating. I didn't wait another second. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and left as quickly as I could. And from that night on, I made sure never to look back. It was a cold, rainy night. The kind of night where the sound of raindrops hitting the windows blends with the hum of the bar's dimly lit lights. The pub had been quiet, almost eerily so. The usual crowd had come and gone, leaving only a few stragglers nursing their last drinks. I was alone, as usual, finishing up some cleaning before the final lockup, but something felt different that night. The clock struck 3 a.m., just like every other night. My hands were busy wiping down the counter when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my stomach dropped, but when I looked up, I saw nothing. The pub was still, and the sound seemed to dissipate as quickly as it had come. I shrugged it off, trying to ignore the creeping sensation of unease building in my chest. Then, I heard it again, the faint scrape of a chair moving across the floor. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but there was no one in sight. The dim glow of the pub's lanterns flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I couldn't shake it. But then, I made the mistake. I broke the rule. You see, I had been told countless times to never stay in the pub alone after midnight. That was rule number 1. But that night, something pushed me to test it. I had worked in that pub for months now, and I had grown too comfortable with the eerie whispers of the night. I didn't believe in the ghost stories, in the tales of the woman in the corner booth or the disappearances tied to the jukebox. No, I thought they were just stories, just things the regulars said to spook the new guy. But as I stood in the middle of the bar, surrounded by the echoes of the night, I had an unsettling feeling that I could no longer ignore. I walked over to the door and made sure it was locked tight. I then looked around the pub, and for the first time I felt alone. The door slammed behind me, the air grew cold, and I knew, deep down, that I had made a terrible mistake. I didn't realize it at first, but I had broken more than just rule number 1. The pub itself seemed to shift in response. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, more oppressive. A strange energy hung in the air, as if the walls themselves were alive. breathing, watching. The lights flickered again, but this time, they didn't just flicker. They buzzed and hummed, as if something was trying to force its way through them. And then, the jukebox began to play. It was slow at first, the familiar hum of the machine grinding to life, but the song it played was one I had never heard before. It was an old, mournful tune, its melody haunting, as though it came from a time long forgotten. It filled the room, the sound echoing in my ears, vibrating through my chest. The air seemed to thicken with each note. I felt my pulse quicken as I glanced around, unsure of what to do. That's when I noticed her, the woman in the corner booth, sitting still, as she always did. But this time, she wasn't as far away. This time, she was closer, a shadow, moving, slipping from one corner of the room to the other. Her dark, veiled face remained hidden, but there was something about her presence that filled the room with dread. She was staring at me. I could feel her eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. The jukebox played on, and I felt a sudden, sharp chill in my bones. The shadows in the pub stretched and twisted, warping like dark tendrils reaching for me. The woman in the corner booth seemed to grow taller, as if she was no longer sitting, but rising from the booth, her figure bending unnaturally. Her hands, pale and long, reached out toward me. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The buzzing of the lights grew louder, and I realized that I wasn't alone. A voice, soft and insistent, whispered through the darkness, "You shouldn't have stayed." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, and I felt a weight on my chest. The woman moved toward me, slow, deliberate, her presence dragging the very air from the room. I finally broke free from the trance I was in and ran toward the door, but as my hand touched the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. I was trapped, and that's when the true horror of the pub revealed itself. The walls seemed to shift, closing in around me. The air grew thick, suffocating, as though the very building was alive. I turned around, my heart pounding, and there she was, the woman standing in front of me now. Her veil had lifted and her face was pale, but her eyes, those eyes, they weren't human. They were black pits, empty and endless, sucking the light from the room. The jukebox's song was louder now, louder than ever before. The floor beneath me trembled, as if the pub itself was about to collapse. I stumbled back, my mind racing, but the woman reached out, grabbing my arm with a cold, bone-crushing grip. "You should have left when you had the chance," she said, her voice hollow and echoing, as if it came from the depths of the earth itself. I struggled, but her grip tightened. The lights flickered one last time, then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. Then, it happened. I saw something that would haunt me forever. A figure appeared from the shadows, a dark shape moving through the room. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence, its evil intent. It was as though the darkness had taken form, manifesting itself before me. It was a shadow of something long lost, a remnant of the pub's past. The figure moved toward the woman and they merged, becoming one, like two spirits bound together by something ancient and malevolent. The woman, now transformed into something far darker, stepped closer to me, her face twisted into a grotesque smile. "This is the price for breaking the rules," she hissed. "You'll never leave. You'll never see the light of day again." The room began to spin. I tried to fight, tried to break free, but it was no use. The shadows closed in, and I felt the life draining from me, as though the very air was being sucked from my lungs. I was lost, trapped, a part of the pub now, just another ghost among the others. The true nature of the pub had been revealed. It wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. The very fabric of the building was bound to a dark past, tied to the spirits of those who had entered and never left. The pub was a prison, a place where the past and present collided, where the shadows of the dead lingered, waiting for the next soul to break the rules and join them in eternal darkness. And now, I was a part of it, the bartender who had stayed too long, the one who had broken the rule. And no one would ever hear my story, not until it was their turn to work the night shift at the Old Lantern. I used to think the rules were just superstitions, strange little quirks meant to entertain the regulars and keep them coming back for more. But after everything I witnessed after what happened that night, I know better. Those rules were not just made up to pass the time. They were the only thing keeping the darkness at bay, the only thing that stood between the living and the dead. And by breaking them, I crossed a line I couldn't undo. The Old Lantern wasn't just a pub, it was a trap, a place where the past bled into the present, and the rules, those strange, eerie guidelines, were what kept the cursed spirits, the shadows, and the evil forces confined. They were the boundaries that separated the living from the spirits who never left, the ones who had broken the same rules in their time. Each rule was there for a reason, and I learned that the hard way. The first rule, never stay alone after midnight, was perhaps the most important one. That was when the spirits began to wake, when the line between the living and the dead became thin. It was when the pub itself seemed to come alive, drawing in anyone who stayed too long. The moment I broke it, I felt the shift. I felt the eyes of the pub on me, the presence that was always there, waiting for someone to make the mistake I made. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong. The pub knew better. Then came rule number 2, close the shutters at 3 a.m. I had ignored it, thinking it was just a part of the bar's strange routine, but the moment I left them open, I realized something. There was a reason the shutters had to be closed at that time. It was a protective barrier, something to shield the pub from the horrors that waited just beyond. By leaving them open, I invited the darkness in, and once it was in, there was no getting it out. Rule number 3, the woman in the corner booth was the one I struggled with the most. She wasn't just a strange figure sitting quietly in the shadows. She was a warning, a manifestation of the pub's power. Her presence signaled that something bad was about to happen, that the veil between the living and the dead was thin. I should have listened, should have kept my distance. But curiosity got the best of me, and once I looked into her eyes, I was trapped. The others, rule number 4, asking about the past. Rule number 5, the flickering lights. Rule number 6, the jukebox. And rule number 7, the footsteps, were all warnings, each one leading me closer to the truth that the pub wasn't just haunted by random spirits. It was a vessel, a place bound to an ancient curse. It was a place where the rules existed to protect the living, to keep us from becoming part of its dark, twisted past. I used to think I was immune to these things, immune to superstition, immune to the strange happenings that made others afraid. But the longer I worked there, the more I realized how much I didn't understand. The pub wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, one that fed off the souls of those who made the mistake of staying too long. And the more you broke the rules, the deeper you sank into its grasp. I never believed in the supernatural. I never thought that the old stories and ghost tales could be real. But now I see it, I feel it. The pub has changed me. I've seen things that no one should ever see, things that no one should ever experience. And yet, I'm still here, trapped by my own actions. Since that night, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every time I walk into the pub, I can feel the presence of the spirits, the ones who never left, the ones who are bound to the old lantern. I hear whispers in the dark, see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, and every time I hear the jukebox play, my heart races, knowing that someone else is about to disappear, that someone else is about to join the ranks of the lost souls. The regulars, the ones who've been here for years, know the truth. They follow the rules, not because they want to, but because they have to. They've seen the darkness, felt it, lived it. They know what happens when the rules are broken, when the spirits are awakened. Some of them have been here for so long that they've forgotten what it's like to be free, to be a part of the living world. They are just as much a part of the pub as the furniture, as the walls, as the spirits that haunt it. And now, I'm one of them. I've become part of the pub, just like the rest. I'm not the skeptic I once was. I can't be. Not after what I've seen, but as much as I've tried to escape, as much as I've wanted to leave, I can't. Something holds me here, something darker than I could have ever imagined. The pub has a hold on me now. It won't let me go. I'm stuck in this loop, bound by the very rules I thought were just stories. And now I have to follow them, or I'll join the others. Those who broke the rules and never left. The ones who became part of the pub, lost forever in its dark history. I'm not sure how much longer I can stay. I don't know if I can endure this forever. But one thing is certain. The pub won't let me go. I've crossed a line, and now I'm a part of it. And the worst part? I'm starting to forget what it was like to be free. The longer I stay, the more I feel myself changing. The pub is seeping into my soul, and I can feel the darkness wrapping around me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. It's only a matter of time before I'm lost to it completely. The rules were there for a reason. I've learned that now, and I hope the next bartender who takes my place learns them too. Because the pub doesn't just take the living, it takes their souls. And once you're part of it, there's no going back. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more spine-chilling tales, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share this with your friends and let us know in the comments. What would you do if you were stuck in the old lantern? Would you break the rules or would you leave before it's too late? Stay safe out there. You never know when the next shadow might be watching.